The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Harold Thompson's modest white house, casting warm shadows across his bedroom floor. At exactly 5:30 a.m., just like every other morning for the past 50 years, the 93-year-old veteran opened his eyes. His body might have aged, but his military discipline remained as strong as ever. Harold's wrinkled hands moved slowly but surely as he made his bed with perfect hospital corners, a habit he couldn't shake since his days in the Pacific during World War II. The old springs of his mattress creaked as he smoothed out every wrinkle in the light blue bedsheet, making sure it was tight enough to bounce a quarter off of it. In the bathroom mirror, he carefully combed his thin white hair and straightened his collar. His reflection showed a face marked by time, deep wrinkles around his kind blue eyes and sun-spotted skin that told stories of years spent outdoors. But there was still a sparkle in those eyes, a hint of the young soldier who had served his country with pride so many years ago. The kitchen of his small house was spotless, everything in its proper place. Harold moved around with practiced ease, despite his age and the wooden cane he used for support. He prepared his breakfast the same way he had since his wife Martha passed away 5 years ago. 2 slices of whole wheat toast, 1 scrambled egg, and a cup of black coffee. The coffee maker gurgled softly as he stood at his window, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Pine Grove had changed a lot since Harold first moved here in 1945. What was once a quiet street lined with young families starting their lives after the war had grown into a bustling neighborhood. Most of the original neighbors were long gone, replaced by new faces he barely knew. Still, he kept his property in perfect order, just as Martha would have wanted. After breakfast, Harold put on his old gardening hat and stepped out onto his front porch. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of spring. His collection of wind chimes tinkled gently in the breeze, playing a peaceful melody that reminded him of Martha's laugh. She had hung those chimes herself, saying their house needed some music. The pride of Harold's day was tending to his rose garden. 13 varieties of roses bloomed in neat rows along his white picket fence, each one carefully labeled with small wooden markers. Martha had started this garden, and after she passed, Harold had learned everything he could about rose care from library books and the local garden club. Now his roses were the talk of the neighborhood, especially the peace roses, which were Martha's favorites. Every morning, he spent 2 hours caring for his flowers. He moved slowly between the bushes, checking each plant for signs of disease or pests, deadheading spent blooms, and pulling any weeds that dared to sprout. His old joints protested as he knelt down, but he didn't mind. This garden was his connection to Martha, and he treated it with the same dedication he had shown during his military service. Mrs. Chen from next door would often wave to him as she left for work, and sometimes she brought him homemade dumplings. The neighborhood children knew him as the Candy Man because he always kept a jar of butterscotch candies by his front door. He enjoyed their visits, especially when they asked about his military service or the old photographs displayed in his living room. After tending to his roses, Harold would settle into his favorite wooden rocking chair on the porch. The chair had been a gift from his children on his 80th birthday, and its gentle creaking kept time with the wind chimes as he watched the world go by. Sometimes he would doze off, dreaming of younger days when Martha sat beside him, both of them planning their future in this very spot. Life wasn't exciting, but Harold liked it that way. He had seen enough excitement during the war to last several lifetimes. These quiet days were his reward for surviving those difficult years. His routine was simple but meaningful: garden, rest, wave to neighbors, read his newspaper, and remember the good times. Each evening, he would watch the sunset from his porch, thankful for another peaceful day in the life he had built. Little did Harold know that his peaceful world was about to change dramatically. But for now, on this particular spring morning, he sat contentedly in his rocking chair, sipping his second cup of coffee, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing on the horizon. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in May. Harold was pruning his peace roses when he heard the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. The sound grew louder and louder until it felt like thunder rolling through his peaceful street. He straightened up slowly, leaning on his cane, and watched as 12 motorcycles roared past his house. The bikes pulled into the empty lot next door, kicking up clouds of dust that drifted over his precious rose garden. The lot had been vacant since old Mr. Peterson's hardware store burned down 3 years ago. Harold had always hoped someone would build something nice there, maybe a small park or a new family business. Instead, he now watched as leather-clad figures dismounted their bikes and began unloading coolers and camping chairs. The group called themselves the Night Ravens, as Harold would later learn from the patches on their leather vests. Most of them were young men in their 20s and 30s, with a few older riders who seemed to be in charge. They set up their gathering spot right against Harold's fence, seemingly unbothered by the fact that they were barely 10 feet from his property line. At first, Harold tried to be neighborly. He remembered how people had sometimes judged him harshly when he returned from the war, and he didn't want to make the same mistake. Walking over to his fence, he called out a friendly greeting. "Afternoon, fellows. Welcome to Pine Grove." A few of the bikers looked his way, but most ignored him. One tall man with a thick beard and tattooed arms gave him a dismissive wave before turning back to his conversation. The afternoon wore on, and the gathering grew louder. More motorcycles arrived, bringing the total to around 20 bikes. The air filled with cigarette smoke, loud music from portable speakers, and constant bursts of rough laughter. Empty beer cans began to litter the ground, some rolling onto Harold's property in the breeze. When the sun started to set, Harold expected them to pack up and leave. Instead, someone started a bonfire, and the party grew even rowdier. The music got louder, and the language became more offensive. Harold could hear every word from inside his house, even with all the windows closed. He couldn't concentrate on his evening newspaper or hear his favorite radio programs. Around 9 o'clock, Harold decided he had to say something. He put on his old navy jacket, hoping it might earn him some respect, and walked back to the fence. "Excuse me," he called out over the noise. "Would you mind turning down the music a bit? Some of us are trying to get some rest." The music stopped abruptly. A muscular man with a shaved head, who seemed to be one of the leaders, walked over to the fence. His vest had a patch that read Razor. He looked down at Harold with cold eyes. "Got a problem, old-timer?" "No problem," Harold replied calmly, though his heart was beating faster. "Just asking for a little courtesy. There are families with young children in this neighborhood." Razor smirked and turned to his companions. "Hey boys, Grandpa here wants us to be more courteous." The group erupted in mocking laughter. Someone in the back revved their motorcycle engine repeatedly, creating an ear-splitting noise that made Harold wince. "Listen up, old man," Razor said, stepping closer to the fence. "This is public property. We can do whatever we want here, whenever we want. Maybe you should invest in some earplugs." More laughter followed this statement, along with several engine revs. Harold stood his ground for a moment, looking at the hostile faces illuminated by the bonfire. He had faced worse in the war, but something about these young men's complete lack of respect made his stomach turn. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his house, their laughter following him all the way. That night, Harold lay awake in his bed, listening to the continuing noise from outside. The party didn't wind down until after midnight. As he finally drifted off to sleep, he had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of his troubles. The peaceful life he had built over the years was about to face its greatest challenge since the war. Tomorrow, he would call the police. Surely, they would help an old veteran deal with these troublemakers. But deep down, Harold had a feeling it wouldn't be that simple. The Night Ravens had chosen their territory, and they didn't look like the type to leave without a fight. The following week proved Harold's worst fears true. His call to the police had backfired spectacularly. Officer Jenkins had come by, talked to the bikers for a few minutes, and left without taking any action. The next day, Harold found his mailbox knocked over and tire tracks across his front lawn, cutting ugly black lines through his carefully maintained grass. Mrs. Chen watched from her window as Harold slowly worked to set the mailbox straight again. She wanted to help, but the look of determination on his face told her this was something he needed to do himself. It took him nearly 2 hours in the hot sun, his old hands shaking as he tightened the bolts, but he got it done. When he finished, he stood back and looked at his work with quiet pride, only to hear the distant rumble of motorcycles approaching again. This time, 5 bikes pulled up, deliberately revving their engines right in front of Harold's house. Razor, the leader who had mocked him before, circled his motorcycle slowly around Harold's freshly repaired mailbox. "Nice work, old-timer," he called out with a smirk. "Would be a shame if something happened to it again." Harold's hands tightened on his cane, but he said nothing. He had learned in the war that sometimes silence was the best defense. He turned his back on them and walked toward his porch, trying to ignore the sound of their laughter and the clouds of exhaust they deliberately blew his way. The harassment continued day after day. Empty beer cans and cigarette butts began appearing in Harold's rose garden every morning. His prized peace roses, the ones that reminded him most of Martha, were trampled one night. The wind chimes that had hung on his porch for 20 years disappeared, only to be found broken in the empty lot next door. The worst part was the noise. The bikers seemed to know exactly when Harold was trying to rest. They would rev their engines during his afternoon nap time, blast music late into the night, and hold loud conversations right by his bedroom window. Sleep became a luxury Harold could rarely enjoy. Other neighbors were affected too, but no one dared to complain. The night ravens had developed a reputation for retaliation. When Mr. Rodriguez from down the street had called the police about their noise, his car tires were slashed the next day. There was no proof it was the bikers, of course, but everyone knew. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch trying to read his newspaper despite the constant noise next door, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A group of younger bikers were watching his house and pointing, passing something between them that looked suspiciously like spray paint cans. He thought about the photographs of Martha that hung in his living room, the medals from his service that decorated his walls, and all the memories stored in his humble home. That night, Harold did something he hadn't done in years. He went down to his basement and opened an old trunk. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, was his old service uniform. As he ran his fingers over the medals and insignias, memories flooded back, not of the fighting, but of the strategy meetings, the careful planning, the ways his unit had outsmarted their enemies rather than outfought them. Sitting there in his basement, surrounded by the echoes of his past, Harold realized something important. He had been fighting this battle all wrong. He was trying to face the bikers head-on, just like they wanted. But he hadn't survived the war by being predictable or confrontational. He had survived by being smart, by gathering intelligence, by understanding his opponent's weaknesses. A plan began to form in his mind. It would take time, patience, and all the strategic thinking he could muster. But as he heard another motorcycle roar past his house, Harold smiled for the first time in weeks. The night ravens thought they were dealing with a helpless old man. They were about to learn that old soldiers never lose their fighting spirit. They just learn to fight smarter. As he climbed the stairs back to his living room, Harold felt younger than he had in years. The war had taught him that the biggest battles aren't always won with fists or weapons, but with intelligence and strategy. It was time to put those lessons to use once again. That night, as Harold lay in his bed listening to the rumble of motorcycles outside, his mind traveled back to 1944. He remembered sitting in a small tent on a Pacific island, studying maps by lamplight with his commanding officer, Captain Richards. The key to victory, Richards had always said, isn't about who has the most strength, it's about who has the most information. Harold got up and walked to his window, watching the shadows of bikers moving around their bonfire next door. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out an old notebook from his bedside drawer. Martha had given him this notebook years ago to write down his war memories, but he had never used it. Now, it would serve a different purpose. Sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Harold began to write. His handwriting was shaky, but determined, as he listed everything he knew about the night ravens. Their arrival times, their patterns, which bikes belonged to which members, who seemed to be in charge. He noted how Razor always parked his bike in the same spot, how the younger members sought his approval, how the group seemed most active on weekends. As he wrote, memories of his military intelligence training surfaced. Back then, they had called it knowing your enemy. They would spend weeks observing Japanese troop movements, learning their routines, finding their weak points. Harold realized he needed to do the same now. The next morning, Harold made a few important phone calls. First, he called his grandson Tommy, who worked in it. "I need some help with technology," Harold explained. Tommy was surprised. His grandfather had never shown interest in modern gadgets before, but he agreed to come over that weekend. Next, Harold called his old friend George from the Veterans Affairs office. They talked for an hour about property laws and local ordinances. George promised to send him some useful documents. Finally, he called Mrs. Chen next door, whose second-floor window had a perfect view of the empty lot. When Tommy arrived on Saturday, he brought several small security cameras and helped Harold set them up discreetly around his property. He showed his grandfather how to use a tablet to view the footage and even taught him how to save important clips. "But why do you need all this, Grandpa?" Tommy asked, concerned. Harold just smiled and patted his grandson's shoulder. "Sometimes the best way to fight isn't with your fists, but with your mind," he said, remembering Captain Richard's words. Tommy looked worried but didn't press further. That night, unable to sleep due to the usual noise, Harold started reviewing the camera footage. He noticed things he hadn't seen before. The bikers weren't just a random group. They had a hierarchy, a structure. Some members always arrived first to secure the area. Others came later, carrying mysterious packages. Harold wrote everything down in his notebook. During the day, he began taking walks around the neighborhood, something he hadn't done in years. He talked to other neighbors, listening to their stories about the bikers. He learned that the Night Ravens had tried to establish themselves in other parts of town, but had been pushed out. This empty lot was their last option. Mrs. Chen, watching from her window, noticed how Harold seemed different now. He no longer looked defeated when the bikers arrived. Instead, he would sit on his porch, quietly observing them while writing in his notebook. Sometimes she saw him smile slightly, as if he knew something they didn't. One week into his surveillance, Harold made his most important discovery. Late at night, while reviewing footage, he noticed something interesting about the packages some members brought. He remembered similar patterns from his war days, when people were trying to hide something they didn't want others to see. Harold opened his old trunk again, this time pulling out a small box containing his military medals. Among them was a silver star for strategic planning that had saved his entire unit. As he held it, a complete plan began forming in his mind. He would need help, timing, and most importantly, patience. But for the first time since the bikers arrived, Harold felt truly confident. Setting his medals aside, he pulled out a fresh page in his notebook and began writing his strategy. Just like in the war, this battle would be won with intelligence, not force. The Night Ravens thought they were dealing with a weak old man, but they were about to learn that some of the most dangerous minds come with gray hair and decades of experience. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold's house became a secret intelligence center. His kitchen table, once reserved for solitary meals and crossword puzzles, was now covered with notes, photographs, and maps. Tommy had taught him how to use his tablet to take screenshots from the security camera footage, and these images were carefully organized in folders marked with dates and times. Mrs. Chen proved to be an invaluable ally. From her second-floor window, she could see parts of the lot that Harold's cameras couldn't capture. She began keeping her own notebook, recording license plate numbers and the times when suspicious packages arrived. Every morning, she would bring Harold fresh dumplings and share her observations from the previous night. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday afternoon when Harold was reviewing his footage for the third time. He noticed something he had missed before, a white van that always parked 2 blocks away whenever the bikers had their larger gatherings. The van never came closer, but people from the group would walk to it and return with paper bags. Harold asked Tommy to help him zoom in on the van's license plate. His grandson hesitated, sensing there was more to this than simple curiosity. "Grandpa, are you sure you're not getting into something dangerous?" Tommy asked, concerned. Harold just smiled and patted his grandson's hand. "Sometimes the most dangerous thing is doing nothing," he replied. Using his old military field glasses, Harold began observing the van more closely. He noticed it had a small business logo on the side, though it was partly covered with tape. He carefully wrote down what he could see of the company name and asked Tommy to look it up online. The results were interesting. The company had been shut down 6 months ago for illegal activities. Meanwhile, Harold's notebook filled with other important details. He knew that Razor, the leader, always arrived at exactly 7:30 p.m. on Thursdays. 2 younger members, who called themselves Spike and Ghost, seemed to handle most of the money that changed hands during their gatherings. Another member, a tall man with a red beard who others called Doc, appeared to be keeping records in a small black book. One night, while pretending to clean up trash from his yard, Harold overheard a heated argument between Razor and Doc. They were discussing someone named Big Mike and something about territory payments. Harold recognized these terms from his military days when they had tracked illegal operations. He added this information to his growing collection of evidence. Mrs. Chen's teenage son, Kevin, helped Harold create a simple computer spreadsheet to organize all his data. Kevin was good with computers, and he showed Harold how to add dates, times, and notes in an organized way. Together, they created a detailed timeline of the Night Ravens' activities. The more information Harold gathered, the clearer the picture became. The Night Ravens weren't just a noisy motorcycle club. They were involved in something much bigger. Their late-night meetings, the mysterious van, the exchanges of packages and money, it all pointed to activities that would interest law enforcement. But Harold knew that going to the police with just this information wouldn't be enough. He remembered how Officer Jenkins had dismissed his earlier complaints. He needed more concrete evidence, and more importantly, he needed leverage. Something that would make the Night Ravens take him seriously. That opportunity came unexpectedly through George at the Veterans Affairs office. While researching property records for Harold, George discovered something interesting about the empty lot. It wasn't just any piece of vacant land. It legally belonged to the local Veterans Association, which had acquired it years ago in a property swap. Harold sat at his kitchen table that night, looking at all the information spread out before him. He had names, dates, patterns of behavior, photographic evidence, and now, most importantly, legal leverage over their gathering spot. In his military days, this kind of intelligence work would have earned him a commendation. Now, it might just help him reclaim his peaceful life. As he heard motorcycles approaching outside, Harold carefully stored all his evidence in a secure place. The time for gathering information was almost over. Soon, it would be time to put his plan into action. But first, he needed to make one more important phone call to a private investigator recommended by George who specialized in cases involving veterans. The Night Ravens had no idea that the quiet old man they had been tormenting was actually a skilled strategist who had spent weeks building a case against them. They were about to learn that underestimating a veteran was a serious mistake. Sarah Martinez, the private investigator Harold hired, turned out to be worth every penny of his savings. A former military intelligence officer herself, she understood exactly what Harold needed. Within a week, she had compiled a thick folder of information that made Harold's eyes widen as he read through it. "You were right about everything, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, sitting at his kitchen table one morning. The bikers were usually quiet during the early hours, making it safe to talk. The Night Ravens aren't just a motorcycle club. They're involved in several illegal operations, and some of their members have interesting backgrounds. Harold carefully spread out the documents she had brought. Razor, whose real name was Richard Rick Dawson, had 3 outstanding warrants in neighboring counties for assault and drug possession. 4 other Corps members were violating their parole just by being part of the group. The white van Harold had spotted was connected to a known drug distribution network. But the most surprising discovery was about the land itself. Sarah had dug deeper into the property records George had found. "The Veterans Association doesn't just own the lot," she explained, pointing to a document. "They have specific guidelines about its use. Any activity there needs to be approved by the board, and more importantly, by the senior veteran member of the district." Harold looked at her in surprise. "And who would that be?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sarah smiled. "You, Mr. Thompson. As the oldest living veteran in Pine Grove and a lifetime member of the association, you have direct authority over how this land is used." Harold sat back in his chair, memories flooding back of the day he had joined the Veterans Association right after the war. He had never paid much attention to the administrative side of things, preferring to focus on helping fellow veterans. Now, that long-ago decision had given him unexpected power. The next few days were spent carefully organizing all the evidence. Harold created 3 separate folders. The first contained proof of the Night Ravens' illegal activities, which would interest law enforcement. The second held documents about the property rights and Harold's authority over the land. The third, and most interesting to Harold, contained personal information about each gang member. What fascinated him most were the military connections he discovered. Razor had tried to join the Marines but had been discharged during basic training. 2 other members came from military families but had rebelled against their parents' expectations. Even Doc, the record keeper, had once applied to work as a military mechanic. Sarah had also uncovered something that made Harold's strategic mind light up. The Night Ravens were in trouble with a larger motorcycle gang over territory disputes. They needed this location because they had been pushed out of their other gathering spots. This explained their aggressive defense of the lot. They had nowhere else to go. Harold spent a long night thinking about everything he had learned. He remembered Captain Richard's words from the war. The best victory is the one where your enemy becomes your ally. Looking at the young men's backgrounds, Harold saw not just criminals, but lost souls who had wanted to be part of something meaningful. The next morning, Harold made two final preparations. First, he had Sarah make copies of all their evidence and store them in 3 separate secure locations. Second, he wrote a detailed letter to the local newspaper describing the situation and his military service, to be delivered only if something went wrong. Then, he put on his old Navy jacket, the one with his service medals still pinned to it. He placed the 3 folders in his worn leather briefcase, the same one he had carried during his service. As he heard the first motorcycles arriving for their evening gathering, Harold stood up straight, feeling the weight of his years but also the strength of his experience. Mrs. Chen watched from her window as Harold walked slowly but purposefully toward the lot. She wanted to stop him, to tell him it was too dangerous, but something in his posture reminded her of old photographs she had seen of military commanders. This wasn't a frightened old man walking into danger. This was a veteran implementing a carefully planned strategy. Harold gripped his cane firmly as he approached the group. The time for gathering intelligence was over. Now it was time for action, and he had something much more powerful than threats or violence. He had understanding, leverage, and most importantly, a plan that could turn enemies into allies. The sun was setting as Harold approached the group of bikers, casting long shadows across the empty lot. The rumble of motorcycles died down as one by one. The night ravens noticed the old veteran walking toward them. Some laughed, others looked confused, but all eyes were on Harold as he made his way to the center of their gathering. Razor stepped forward, his leather vest creaking as he crossed his arms. Well, if it isn't Grandpa coming to complain again, he sneered. The other bikers formed a loose circle around Harold, some cracking their knuckles threateningly. But Harold wasn't afraid. He had faced worse odds in the Pacific. "Good evening, Richard," he said calmly, using Razor's real name. The biker's smirk faltered for a moment. "Or would you prefer I call you Private Dawson? Though you didn't keep that title very long at Paris Island, did you?" The color drained from Razor's face. The other bikers looked at their leader in confusion. Harold set his briefcase on a nearby picnic table and opened it slowly. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about a few things," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his military years. "First," Harold continued, pulling out the property documents, "this lot belongs to the Veterans Association, and as senior veteran member of this district, I have final say over its use." He paused, letting that sink in. "Which means I could have you all removed right now if I wanted to." Razor's hands clenched into fists, but before he could speak, Harold pulled out the second folder. "I also have here detailed records of various parole violations, outstanding warrants, and other activities that would interest the police." He looked directly at Doc, the record keeper, especially that white van that parks 2 blocks away every Thursday. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Some of the younger members started backing away, but Harold wasn't finished. He pulled out the 3rd folder, the most important one. "But what interests me most," he said, his voice softening slightly, "is what I learned about all of you." He turned to a young biker with a skull tattoo. "James, your grandfather served in Vietnam. He received a Bronze Star." The young man's eyes widened in surprise. "And Mike," Harold continued, looking at another member, "your mother is still active duty Air Force, isn't she?" One by one, Harold revealed what he knew about each member, their connections to military service, their failed attempts to enlist, their family histories. With each revelation, the hostile atmosphere began to change. These weren't just random facts. They were pieces of their lives they had tried to hide or forget. "You all wanted to be part of something bigger than yourselves," Harold said, his voice carrying across the now quiet lot. "I understand that. I felt the same way when I joined the Navy." He looked around the circle. "But this," he gestured to the beer cans and cigarette butts littering the ground, "this isn't the answer." Razor stepped forward again, but this time his stance was less threatening. "What's your point, old man? You going to turn us in?" Harold smiled for the first time. "Actually, I have a different proposal." He pulled out one final document from his briefcase. "The Veterans Association has been looking to establish a community center in this area. We need people who can help maintain the property, provide security, and organize events." The bikers looked at each other, confused. Harold continued, I'm offering you a chance to be part of something legitimate, something meaningful. He looked directly at Razor. You wanted to be a Marine, Richard. It's not too late to serve your community in a different way. A long silence followed. The only sound was the distant traffic and the flutter of paper as the evening breeze caught the edges of Harold's documents. The sun had almost set completely now, and in the growing darkness, the bikers looked younger, more uncertain. Finally, Doc spoke up. What exactly are you suggesting? Harold straightened his back, standing as tall as his old frame would allow. I'm suggesting a deal, one that benefits us both. He tapped his cane on the ground for emphasis. But first, you need to decide. Do you want to keep being part of the problem, or are you ready to be part of the solution? The Night Ravens looked at their leader, waiting for his response. In that moment, Harold saw something change in Razor's eyes. A glimpse of the young man who had once dreamed of wearing a different kind of uniform. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening in the empty lot, and Pine Grove had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The old vacant space that had once been a source of trouble was now transformed into the Pine Grove Veterans Community Center, and the change was nothing short of remarkable. Where beer cans and cigarette butts had littered the ground, there now stood a well-maintained building with a small memorial garden. The Night Ravens hadn't just accepted Harold's offer, they had embraced it with unexpected enthusiasm. Their motorcycles still lined the parking lot, but now they were there for a different purpose. Razor, who now preferred to be called Rick, had discovered he had a talent for organization. He coordinated maintenance schedules and security rotations with military precision. The skills he had used to lead his gang were now being put to better use managing community events and veteran support programs. Doc, with his meticulous record-keeping abilities, became the center's unofficial administrator. His black book now contained lists of veterans needing assistance, upcoming events, and community projects rather than shadowy dealings. He had even started taking online classes in business administration. The younger members found purpose in helping elderly veterans with home repairs and yard work. The physical strength they had once used to intimidate was now used to build wheelchair ramps and fix leaky roofs. Their leather vests still bore the Night Ravens patch, but underneath it was a new one that read Veterans Community Support Team. Harold's rose garden had been restored, and new flowers were added to create a peaceful sitting area for veterans to gather and share stories. The wind chimes that had been destroyed were replaced with new ones, their gentle music now a symbol of the change that had come to Pine Grove. Mrs. Chen no longer watched nervously from her window. Instead, she provided lunch for the weekly Veterans Support Group meetings, her dumplings becoming a favorite among the regulars. Her son Kevin had started teaching basic computer skills to both veterans and former gang members, helping them connect with family and find job opportunities online. One sunny morning, as Harold sat on his porch drinking his coffee, he watched Rick teaching a group of younger veterans about motorcycle maintenance. The lessons took place in a small workshop they had built behind the center. Harold smiled, remembering Rick's surprised face when he learned that Harold had been a motorcycle mechanic in the Navy. You know, Rick had told him recently, I never thought I'd say this, but you did us a favor that night. You saw something in us that we couldn't see ourselves. He had paused, looking at the thriving community center. You fought us with understanding instead of force. That's real strength. The local police, including Officer Jenkins, had become supporters of the center. They saw how the crime rate in the area had dropped significantly since the Night Ravens had found a new purpose. Some officers even started volunteering at the center's events, building bridges with people they had once viewed as troublemakers. Tommy visited his grandfather more often now, proud of what Harold had accomplished. The tablet he had taught Harold to use was now full of photos documenting the center's transformation and the changing lives of its members. Harold had even learned to send emails, keeping in touch with other veterans organizations across the country interested in replicating their success. On special occasions, Harold would still wear his old Navy jacket with its medals, but now he had a new pin on it. A small motorcycle with wings, given to him by the Reformed Night Ravens as a symbol of his honorary membership in their new community service group. The evening peace that Harold had once fought so hard to protect had returned to Pine Grove. But it was different now, richer, more meaningful. The sound of motorcycles no longer brought dread but a sense of community. The lot next door was no longer a source of trouble, but a place of healing and hope. As Harold sat in his rocking chair one evening, watching the sunset while former gang members helped an elderly veteran plant new roses in the memorial garden. He thought about how life's greatest victories often come in unexpected ways. He had set out to fight a gang of troublemakers but had ended up creating a family of supporters. The war had taught Harold how to fight. The peace had taught him something more valuable: how to turn enemies into allies, how to see the potential for good in unexpected places, and how to win battles with wisdom instead of weapons.